feministische economie. Zeg maar vrouwen-economie. Een debat onder leiding van mevrouw Roethoff. In de Bali.
My name is Femke Roethoff. I have been a member of parliament. I just recently lost my seat in the elections. So I might go back to what I've done before, like chairing events like this. Anyway, for me, there's a lot to learn tonight. I would like to invite Mrs. Vinaria to start with her keynote speech.
Perhaps we should remind ourselves, before I talk about the feminist view of globalization, to remind ourselves very, very briefly of the hegemonic view of globalization, which is typified by those who lead in the construction of global markets, starting with the finance sector, the productive sector, and now more and more the service sector, and those who are connected with it. This is the view that celebrates the expansion and deepening of the market across the globe and its accomplishments. It is associated with laissez-faire economics, and the post-1989 triumphalists focus on the victory of capitalism over socialism. It is the view, using the expression of the weekly The Economist, it is the view of the Davos man. Davos making reference to the city in Switzerland that has the annual meetings of the brightest and the best in the business world, in the political world, and so forth. A couple of years ago, The Economist published an article that came right out of the Davos meeting, responding to Samuel Huntington's book, The Crash of Civilization, and saying that the Davos man was going to solve all our problems in terms of the crash of civilizations. The Davos man for The Economist, for that article at least, represents the Bill Gates and George Soros of the world, who, according to The Economist, they are so powerful that they find shaking the hand of an obscure prime minister boring. It is the Davos man has replaced the Chatham man, who, according to the article, was the diplomat, the cultured diplomat, who exercised power through culture and knew about cultures. The Davos man doesn't care about culture. This is a quote: "Some people find Davos men hard to take. There is something uncultured about all the money-grubbing managerialism. But it is part of the beauty of the Davos man that by and large he does not give a fig for culture." And in this case, culture was specified as, you know, Islamic culture, Hindi culture, Italian culture, and so forth. Now, The Economist is fascinated by the Davos man. One of the reasons for this fascination is that, so it argues, he will do away with the tensions between cultures. Through the markets, we will homogenize cultures, and therefore we will get rid of these tensions. In addition to that, we are promised again that through the market, the Davos man is going to increase the wealth of nations and maximize our welfare. And of course, when we say that, we are assuming that there's going to be a lot of trickle down in terms of how the production or the maximization of wealth is going to benefit everybody. And that reminded me, when I was thinking about this today, it reminded me of something that Marianne Ferber, I don't know whether she's here, but she put, last year, talking about trickling down, she put up in the Femicon network something, she reminded us of something that Senator Tom Harkins, who was briefly a candidate for presidency in the United States, and he said, the old theory of trickle-down economics is like feeding the hungry birds by giving the grain to the horses. When I talk about economic restructuring, I'm referring about all the different economic processes, such as the mega mergers, the technological change, reorganization of production, downsizing, that are so much at work in our world and that we read about every day in the newspapers. I will return to the subject of economic restructuring in a minute, but first let me say, the critical view also emphasizes that to a great extent, globalization has responded to the interest of the more economically developed high-income countries and their global institutions, such as multinational corporations and international organizations that have been very instrumental in shaping up the globalization, such as the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. In terms of countries, the US and the Western European countries and Japan, of course, have played a very important role. But as a result of that, also other countries like third world countries and Eastern European countries have really had to follow. They have taken a passive, not a leading role, but a role that in many ways has been shaped out by the leadership of other countries.
There's an old joke about an economist being someone who sees something working in practice and wonders whether it will work in theory. I would argue that out of necessity, a feminist economist is informed by a constant movement between theory and practice, often from a position at the margins of both policymaking and the economics profession. It's perhaps because of this vantage point, which Nancy Hartsock talks about quite a bit, that feminist economics has been able to expose the partiality of accounts about the current period of globalization. Feminist economists see globalization as part of a broader process of restructuring, as Lourdes has mentioned, really of restructuring of the state, of civil society, and of the political economy, as well as of culture. I personally also see it as very much a work in progress. To paraphrase Gramsci, the old order is not yet born. The old order is not yet dead, the new not yet born. Now, globalization is also very much an ideology, and this is something that's really largely left out of economic accounts. And it's an ideology, I would argue, that's largely consistent with the outlook of affluent minorities in the OECD and the urban elites and emerging middle classes in the third world, who benefit from the consumption patterns and the production and financial circuits of transnational capital. In other words, the very people that Galbraith writes about and refers to in The Culture of Contentment. This so-called globalization paradigm has, I think, yet to congeal around such central issues as how the current shift in governance might impact on the citizen, how it might impact on the public and the state, as well as the very vital communities and family networks that are instrumental to survival in the South. And as so often is the case with theory and analysis in the social sciences, the emerging globalization paradigm has been decidedly silent about the gendered underpinnings of the current transformation. Now, feminist economists, especially writers from the South, have consistently demonstrated that restructuring isn't a gender-neutral process, yet this is something that largely has been ignored in the general accounts about globalization.
Isabella Bakker from Canada. I'd like to, we've just heard you talk about globalization and the effect it might have and already has on women in the world. Could you quickly explain what you mean by globalization?
Well, that's almost a tricky question to say that you can explain it quickly, but globalization is really a very complex process, and as we tried to say tonight, it's a contradictory process. In other words, for some people it looks like a good thing, and for many other people it looks like a bad thing. Basically, the way a lot of economists would look at it is they would say it's a change in the way in which things are being produced, in the sense that we now don't need to produce things in one place, they can be produced across the ocean somewhere else. It's a change in the way in which the state interacts with citizens and with the economy. Some people would say that the state, in fact, has been internationalized. Very much more attention is now being paid to the international arena. It's a change, obviously, in technology and knowledge structures, which are becoming more intensified and more accessible globally. And finally, it's a change in migration patterns. We're seeing increasing migration from countries of the South to countries of the North, looking for new opportunities.
Just before, you've talked about trends. This globalization trend has been going on for a while now. And there's also been trends in the way income has been distributed over especially genders, men and women in the world. And would you agree that there is a trend that a bigger proportion of the poor in the world are becoming women and children. And you've talked before about polarization of income and a widening of the gender gap. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I think that generally from the United Nations Human Development Report, we have seen from last year's report that there is a rise in poverty worldwide. And in particular, that tends to strike women and children hardest because they don't have as direct an access to markets and to monetary sources of income. So that's what some of the more recent feminist literature has been concerned about. In the North, of course, with the cutbacks in the state sector and in social services, again, it's women and children who tend to use those services more than men, so they are affected disproportionately in a negative way if those services are cut.
And also because the people that work in those services would generally be women as well. So they'd be cut in two ways, I suppose.
Yeah, yes, that's right. A lot of the good job opportunities for women in the post-war period, or at least since the 1960s, were in the public sector. That's where they had better work conditions, certainly much higher wages in general than in the private sector. And we are seeing an erosion of those gains.
So how would you say that that we can turn this trend, or does the whole restructuring process of globalization, which always is an opportunity for change, how can we take that opportunity and turn it in the favor of women in particular? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the first thing is to reveal that the restructuring process is a gendered process, first of all, that it's not gender neutral, that it affects men and women, boys and girls differently. And the second thing is really to engage at the local and the national level to pressure for the kind of policies that are beneficial to women and children. In other words, not to give up at the national front. And this is something that we've learned in Canada through the various trade agreements that our government has signed. The women's community has organized quite vigorously, and we found that if there was a lot of objection in the country, then it was much more difficult for our government to go into the international arena and to fulfill those commitments.
So we just have to make sure we're being heard and our objections are known to the people that take decisions for us.
Yes, I think it's very important that NGOs, grassroots activists, and progressive researchers organize together, because unless there is a strong voice outside of Parliament, outside of the halls of decision making, then there's absolutely no pressure, and then it will seem inevitable.
I've got one last question for you. I was very intrigued with your statement of how globalization almost has, there's a myth around it that it is a natural thing that just, grows, and how you expressed and that it is man-made and literally man-made, and that we have to beware of the patriarchal connotations of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I think that the point that feminist economists are trying to stress is that what affects people in their daily lives isn't just what goes on in financial markets, isn't just what goes on in terms of macro policy decision making, but also has a lot to do with how people actually meet their needs on a daily basis. And that's, of course, a much broader question. It has to do with how we use our time, how we can provide for our children and our communities, and how we can build a better future.
Okay, thank you very much.